Hi everyone, my name is Siana Moreno, and today I am going to be with Dr. Fontes interviewing him on Columbia's Day and Indigenous Peoples Day. It is basically an introduction to our new series of having interviews about historic events, and Dr. Fontes will go ahead and provide his input on them and his knowledge.
Thank you, Sienna. So here at Clovis Community College, we are starting a new series of video interviews on history. And so we'll be covering topics like major holidays, Columbus Day, maybe Thanksgiving, Easter, Day of the Dead, and the historical backgrounds of those holidays and other events that Sienna and her colleagues at Clovis Community College will think of. And I'm happy to do these interviews and provide greater historical context to some of these holidays and events that we may not think about.
Thank you, Dr. Fontes. So we're going to go ahead and start with the interview. So the first question we have is who Columbus is. Who is he? What was his mission about? And the monarchs who sent him? And why was 1492 such a huge year in the history of the world?
Well, that's a great question. It's a loaded question. So Christopher Columbus, his name was Cristoforo Colombo in Spanish, and 1451. He was born in the Italian city-state of Genoa, around 300 years before it actually was called Italy. Italy did not become a nation state until 1861. And that's hard for us sometimes to wrap our heads around. We look at a map and we think that's always been Italy. But when Christopher Columbus was born, it was separated by territories and city-states. So I don't think he would have considered himself an Italian foremost. He would have considered himself a Genoese. He was an Italian captain, a Genoese captain who ventured various parts around the Mediterranean, down parts of Africa and up the coast to the British Isles. He had an idea to find a new route to the East Indies for spices. And when we hear spices, we may think of these fantastic spices that aren't in existence anymore. But if you go to Trader Joe's, these spices are still there on the rack, right? At one time, they were so valuable. Cinnamon, cassia, cardamom, ginger, pepper. Think of pepper as being highly valuable that people lost their lives for. That's amazing, right? And turmeric. When the Ottoman Empire formed in the mid 15th century, they controlled the routes to spices, from the overland route from Europe to the East Indies. And they started to charge Europeans a very high rate of taxation to gain access to the areas that sold spices. So Europeans started thinking about an alternate route to gain these spices. And so men like Columbus thought, I will sail west and I will hit India and China. Because at that time, there was no idea that there was another hemisphere in existence. And so he had this idea, I'll sail west to find China and India. And he approached the king of Portugal. He thought about it, and his advisor said, no, this is not a good idea. And so he approached Isabella and Ferdinand in Spain. And Isabella and Ferdinand had consolidated their kingdoms, Aragon and Castile, into one very powerful kingdom. And Spain had been at war with Islamic armies for about 800 years. As Muslim armies entered Spain in the year 711. And for about 800 years, Christian armies and Muslim armies fought each other back and forth until finally the Spanish monarchs conquered the last Muslim holdout, Granada. And 1492 was a big year for Europe because Isabella and Ferdinand kicked every Jew and Muslim out of Spain. They had this mission to purify Spain both racially and for Catholicism. And they were called the most Catholic monarchs in Europe. And so they kicked every Jew and Muslim out of Spain. Those that were left in Spain were forced to convert to Catholicism or die. And this is where we get the Inquisition, because many Jews this was their homeland for centuries, who lived in Spain. They didn't want to leave. So outwardly, they pretended to be Catholics, but at home, they practiced Judaism. Their neighbors told on them. This is where we get the Inquisition, and many thousands of Jews will die because of this. And also Jews in Mexico who flee Spain to go to Mexico later will die at the stake in the center of Mexico City, being burned alive because of this. So 1492 is a very important year because of this, and also Ferdinand and Isabella commissioned Columbus to go find a new route to find spices. And Columbus sails to the New World, the Caribbean, 4 times. He makes 4 voyages from Spain to what is now the Caribbean. And it first lands in Hispaniola, which today is divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And he lands there. And he, besides Vikings like Leif Erikson, he is the first European to make a major impact in landing in what we call the New World. From a European perspective, it was a new world, right? Of course, to the natives, they were already there. They didn't think they were being discovered. But from that point on, Columbus establishes a base in Hispaniola. And think about the great excitement that happened in Europe. I often tell my students, it would be like if we discovered a new dimension or a new planet with people on it. This is how excited Europe was to realize that the Earth had a whole nother hemisphere, and their imaginations went wild. What's there? Are there giants? Many people thought this is the realm of Satan. This is where the devil went when the Lord cast him to the earth. And so you have this 800 years of Reconquista with Spanish armies fighting Muslim armies. And that excitement, that great vigor is sort of carried off to the New World. And we don't often think of Columbus being a missionary, but if you read his journals, he really sees himself as a missionary. He sees himself as carrying forth the gospel in a very Catholic sense. And he thought he was going to find the Garden of Eden. When he finds the estuary in Venezuela, he believes this is the Garden of Eden. And he writes about this in his logbook. And he says he wants to procure much gold and give that to the King and Queen of Spain, and later on Charles V, so that gold will finance missionary endeavors across the world to evangelize and convert natives around the world.
Wow, that's a lot of information.
I can go on, but I'll stop right there.
Oh no, yeah, I wasn't aware of that though. I didn't know he was particularly coming to look for things like pepper and turmeric, things that we would never imagine.
Let me ask you, in your studies, when you hear spices, what do you automatically think?
I think like exotic spices. I don't know, because we first learned about this like in kindergarten. I remember doing like a whole like Thanksgiving at the school I went to, and we had like we dressed up as pilgrims and Indians.
Yeah.
So it just didn't occur to me that it was things like that.
I think in our imagination we think it must have been some kind of magical spice, But
yeah, like something so grand, so valuable that is worth like trade and everything, but nothing that is you'll find every day at Walmart or Trader Joe's.
No, well, food history is really fascinating because we can go to Trader Joe's or Walmart and we have at our fingertips the whole world, really. Mm-hmm. Think about living back then where all you had was, hopefully you had salt.
Yeah.
And then you had maybe grew some onions in your garden, and that was your spices. Mm-hmm. So when these other spices around the world start hitting Europe, and tea and coffee, they go crazy for it because this is new on their tongue. It's an amazing sensation on their tongue. They can't get enough. Yeah.
That's interesting. Thank you for that. So the next question I have for you is, so what were the interactions basically between the natives on Hispaniola and between Columbus men and the natives?
Yeah, that's a loaded question because even that today is saturated with controversy. We know over the last couple of decades, Columbus Day has been under assault because of the atrocities that him and his men committed on Hispaniola from the very start. And the foundational text we have for these atrocities is from a Spanish priest who was there. It's an eyewitness account of the dealings between Columbus and his men and the natives on Hispaniola. And his name was Bartolome de las Casas, and he writes a book called A Brief History of the Destruction of the Indies. And he recounts these points, he saw firsthand of the harsh ways that Columbus and his men treated the natives. Um, Columbus writes that 10 and 11-year-old girls are highly sought after, that his men go out and to procure these girls because the men want the 10-year-old girls to rape. Um, Columbus was personally involved with capturing women to be raped and given to his men. Um, he forced thousands of natives to work as slave laborers to mine gold for him. We have in De Las Casas' account, there were whole villages that committed suicide at one time when they heard the Spanish were coming toward their village, because they already heard of atrocities being committed, and whole villages committed suicide rather than face the cruelty of the Spaniards.
Oh my gosh, that's insane. See, but that's what I'm like so interested about, is because we always get this complete definition in at least the schools I've attended uh, of what Columbus did and the things he stood for and represented. Like, little did we know, until you get older and you go into college, you find out all the harsh atrocities that he actually committed to against people that had no powers and communities even. So when you said that communities were committing suicide, that's pretty saddening to hear, because they had already heard about the stuff that was going to come next to them, and that they'd rather do that than suffer under his rule.
That's right. And I actually have a page here from a 1930 textbook that talks about Columbus, or a children's book. And it says, for the Santa Maria was too badly broken to be put together again. This left Christopher with sailors enough for 2 boats. And besides, he had invited 6 Indians to go back to Spain with him. So this book says Christopher Columbus invited Indians to go back to Spain, where the reality is he kidnapped natives to go back and enslave them and use them for rape and as oddities in Europe, right? So
Wow. Yeah, I feel like that's a lot to take in,
it
because
is.
you're
Oh,
always learning more about it as you get older. At least in my case.
yeah, and another point is that oftentimes when we study past peoples, and I tell my students this also, that we can't always judge them based on our own present day moralities. This is the case in many ways, right? But we have to look to see if there are voices at that time who are speaking out against these things. Mm-hmm. And we know there were. De Las Casas is speaking out against how the Spanish are treating the natives. And he writes a book to Charles V, the emperor, and says, read this. We have to stop this. We're here to preach the gospel. And from his perspective, he's a priest. He wants to convert them. He's saying the Spanish aren't even converting them. They're just treating them like slaves and dogs and rape victims. Mm-hmm. So we can't just say, well, Columbus didn't know better because he was from that time period. Well, we know that people at that time period were calling him out. Mm-hmm. Who said this is wrong, right?
Yeah, there were people speaking out and trying to get the word out, but nothing changed, it seemed like.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, though. And so the next question I have, how is Columbus traditionally being taught in schools?
Well, I think we just touched on that, right? You recall being taught by Columbus, and this is something I often tell my students. On the one hand, it's a very sanitized, whitewashed version of history, Columbus and slavery. And we don't even touch on the Indian genocide that happened in California, where the governor in California in the 1860s was paying a nickel for every Indian scalp that was brought to the state capitol. This was not very long ago. I think we can't teach school-age kids this because it would give them nightmares, right?
Yeah.
but we can't continue to teach this watered-down history that gives them a false sense, kind of fairy tale narrative of American history. I think that people will carry on with him like you have until you're faced with these real facts in college. You go through your life thinking this false narrative. I think that is not fair to children, to teach them these falsities that that simply aren't true, or paint a picture of someone that's not real, right?
Yeah, I agree. Because like how I mentioned, I did not know that Columbus was technically not the best person. Because when you're in kindergarten, when you're in grade school, you always hear, oh, Christopher Columbus founded America, that's like we have to praise him. He's the one who found where we live, where thousands of Americans live. But then you go to college and you're like, oh no, Christopher Columbus committed a genocide practically against indigenous people and ripped their land when this whole time Native Americans were here. But we don't teach, we're not made aware of that in grade school. And I like how you mentioned because it would kind of be considered a lot for like a 6-year-old to know about that information. But I also agree with you. I think that is definitely something that they should teach, but more in a cautious way.
Sure. So on the one hand, we have this critique that Christopher Columbus was part of the age of colonization, that he represents the brutality of the European enterprise in the New World, that this brought upon the Atlantic slave trade, this brought about diseases. So the larger context is a critique of the European colonization project. But specifically, Columbus was specifically involved, personally involved in very bad things done to Native peoples. He personally oversaw enslavement, rape. So as a man, as a person, not talking about the greater European enterprise, but the person himself was a bad man, to put it in very, very clear terms. He was involved in overseeing rape and enslavement, and by any standards throughout history, that is not a good thing. If you go back to the Babylonian law code, to the ancient Germanic law code, to any code that's written down, there are basic tenets of law: murder, rape, theft, taking someone's property. These all appear in ancient law codes. There's no you can't get around this by saying, well, it was a different time period. Mm-hmm. This is all these legal elements have always been a bad thing in all societies that wrote down laws.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always everything he practically did was always considered immoral in society. So, but I get how people would mix it up just because it was what 1492, 14.
Yeah, but there is another aspect of Christians encountering heathens. And it goes back to the Old Testament Bible. If you read the Old Testament, what does the Lord tell the children of Israel when they come out of Egypt after 400 years? He says, here's your promised land. Take it. I give it to you. And that was essentially everything from the Sinai Peninsula all the way to modern day Turkey and Assyria. He says, this is your land, take it. But there are people living in it. And what I want you to do is I want you to kill everyone. Kill every mother, kill every child. The Bible says the suckling and the toddler, all the old people. And God said, not only that, but I want you to kill all the livestock because everything is dirty and unclean. I hate it all. So there is a powerful thread throughout history with this idea of the chosen people, that if you were the chosen people and you go out and preach the gospel or spread the gospel amongst heathen peoples, if they don't immediately convert, then it's justified to kill them. And this is justification in the Old Testament. So when we look at men like Columbus or Manifest Destiny with the Americans and with the natives, and we say, this is not Christianity. Well, in a way it is, in a way it isn't, because it's justified in the Old Testament. The word heathen is a very bad word in the Old Testament. It means someone who worships a false god. In the Old Testament, if someone's doing that and they don't convert to the real God, then you're able to kill them. It's justified under the Old Testament, or the Old Testament God. So when Columbus is doing these things, it's bad in some people's eyes, but in other people's eyes, it's justified because these are heathen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand that from that perspective also, which is really interesting because you never would put together how that like would go hand in hand. I feel like
no, because we modern day American Christianity, we were brought up to believe that true religion is peaceful, that true religion spreads love and peace. Well, there's no universal written rule that says that. Most religions throughout history have been very violent. That's why we have war gods. That's why we have Thor and Ares and Mars and Minerva and Roma and Quetzalcoatl and Yahweh in the Old Testament. These are all very violent gods. And religion is often been violent in history.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And so thank you for that. Also, the next question would be, so what does Columbus mean to Italian Americans and why?
Italians are one of the major groups to come over in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to American shores. Germans and Irish were the two main groups in the 19th century. And later, in the later 19th century, we see a great influx of Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans. And when Italian Americans come to mostly New York and travel across to San Francisco, they come from different regions, right? Genoa, Venice, Rome, and they come with different traditions and with an identity that speaks to the small place they're from. But when they come to the United States, the idea of Italianness solidifies. I think it does here in America more than it does in Italy, because when you come to the United States and you're all alone, you connect with people from your region. And if you don't see another Genoese, you see someone from Rome, you immediately become Italians. This is what happens in New York. And in the 1800s, when this identity of Italianness is forming, they adopt Christopher Columbus as their hero, as sort of their patron saint. Although they all have Mary. Mary is a part of all of their celebrations, their festas. So same thing as Mexicans in Mexico and Chicanos, right? The Virgin of Guadalupe is big in fiestas. Well, in their festas, the Virgin Mary, whatever flavor she is from their own little communities, becomes part of their identity. But the human identity, the icon, the hero, is Christopher Columbus. And they erect statues in the 1800s, much like the Confederate statues, or any statue or memorial that people erect as a source of identity. Christopher Columbus statues are erected by Italian Americans in New York as a source of identity and national pride.
Thank you
And
for
still,
that.
still today, Columbus is a national hero to many Italian Americans.
Mm-hmm. There's even a paid holiday for in America, so it's
Yeah.
interesting. So, on the other hand, how is Columbus viewed to Native Americans, and why is he viewed that way?
Well, when Columbus lands in Hispaniola, there had been 10 to 40,000 years of separation between the natives of the Western Hemisphere and the peoples in Asia and Africa and Europe, called the Old World. And and our DNAs from different parts of the world had developed differently, and our immune systems had developed differently. So when Columbus and his men land Hispaniola, they open a Pandora's box. They bring smallpox, influenza. They bring about 30 diseases to the New World that are unleashed immediately when they step off the boat. And many historians and anthropologists say up to 95%, 95% of the whole Western Hemisphere was wiped out in decades. So that by the time Cortez conquered Tenochtitlan in 1521, most of the Aztecs are already sick from smallpox, right? Smallpox ravishes everything from what is now Argentina all the way to Alaska and kills millions and millions and millions of people. So that's one reason why American natives see Columbus as a very bad figure, not to mention the specific atrocities he was involved with, but also, as I mentioned before, the larger European colonial enterprise, what that ushers into the Americas, the slave trade, the encomienda system in Mexico, which is essentially slavery, the whole 19th century manifest destiny in the United States that sees a genocidal warfare against Native Americans, and also lastly in California, where 99% of the natives are wiped out by a direct assault on natives by the California state government.
Thank you for that. Yes, and another reason I thought that's what I meant to say earlier so much is that we are not made aware of this in grade school. We are not made aware of this until we get to college. We don't know that this genocide practically was taking place against Native American groups, and it all makes so much sense now on why there's not that many of them left in the population because they were wiped out from all the diseases that were brought here, the rapes, the deaths, the slavery.
And we don't think that, like when you mentioned in elementary school, I did too. I'm almost 50. So when I was a little kid in the 70s, we dressed up as Indians and pilgrims, and we're not thinking, well, where are the Indians?
No,
Like,
yeah, me too. I remember thinking that I was like, oh, yeah, I remember we had like little Thanksgiving feast to celebrate the first Thanksgiving, I think it was, that the Pilgrims and the Indians supposedly had. And yeah, we dressed up. Like one person was a Pilgrim, other person was an Indian, and we had a Thanksgiving party feast together. But then you looking back at them, like, oh my gosh, that's so wrong to have because now this whole population is struggling. Even just right now with COVID-19, they're struggling because of the way the disease is affecting them and the resources that they're not available to them.
yeah. So we know from our studies that as Anglo-Saxon America pushed westward, Native Americans were either murdered or they were placed on reservations. And I think reservations is not a good word because we're really environmental ghettos. Native Americans were living on the most beautiful places that they could find, right next to streams, on mountains, and they were then placed in deserts with no running water and very little water, and the land was horrible for agriculture, um, and their society and culture destroyed, and their family members. Very very harsh to deal with. Those who were left, so those who survived that great assault on their culture and people, it was hard to deal with psychologically and emotionally.
Yeah, definitely. And then to think about things like the Trail of Tears, just to take place later on in history,
Mhm.
just how much they've had to undergo and experience, and it's pretty rough, I feel like. And then being of Chicano, you know that that was your ancestors at
Yeah,
some point.
sure. Yeah, I recently did my DNA test, and I'm 44% Native from
Yeah, so
northern
it's
Arizona.
almost 50%, almost half.
Yeah, and then I'm 51% European, which most around 39% is Spanish. So I have both that DNA in me, the conquistador and the people that they assaulted. This is
And that's the history of it right there.
yes, yes.
Yeah, it's crazy how that just goes to show how it's still in you.
And so that goes back to your question: what perspective do the Native Americans have of Columbus? You know, full
Mhm.
500 years of oppression, really, and genocide in the 19th century.
And I feel like it's very important to make awareness on that. I know me personally, I try to use my social media as a platform to bring social issues. And there was like a post I shared yesterday, and it was of a Native American holographed like on the back of a mountain. I'm not sure which one, but it was like it had said like you're on stolen land because technically we're all here. This wasn't our land. This is what we were told it was because Christopher Columbus supposedly came and brought it or founded it. However, it's not. It was here the whole time. Native Americans are taking care of it. They're taking care of their environment. So I feel like it's something. I was so excited to do this video because it's something that really needs to be more talked about.
Yeah, so there's no going back. We can't go back into history and make these wrongs right. His history's already happened. But I think what we can do is I'm surprised that there aren't monuments to this around California. There should be statues and monuments where these acts of genocide occurred. There should be a huge monument in downtown Fresno saying this is where 10,000 Yokuts lived for 10,000 years, but are no longer here. You know, the largest lake in the western U.S., this side of the Mississippi, was in Visalia. It was bigger than Lake Tahoe. It was where 10,000 Yokuts lived for 10,000 years. When pioneers came here, they drained it. They drained it for cattle raising, and they killed off all the natives that lived there, about 10,000 of them. Why there should be a huge monument in Visalia to the slaughter and eradication of these people. We can't go back and make it right, but we can respect and honor the legacy and history of these people who lost their lives due to the Western advancement of the American civilization.
Definitely, I agree. Especially because there is unfortunately, a lot of Christopher Columbus statues in our nation. But I feel like over the recent years, I've seen a lot of people. I know Mexico, they tore theirs down. They ripped, yeah, they like shoved theirs down, and so to bring awareness and stuff. So I think that's definitely important that there should be more monuments to bring awareness and pay respect to the Native Americans. And lastly, I know there was an article published that we talked about that had to do with our president, just speaking a little bit on importance of Columbus Day. I don't know if you wanted to share a little bit of that.
Sure. So on October 9th, a few days ago, the White House issued a statement that is now you go to whitehouse.gov and you can find it. It's called Proclamation on Columbus Day 2020. And what the White House does is they're really advocating a national narrative that smacks of authoritarianism. It smacks of the type of government that America is not. America is about free thinking, the free flow of ideas, the critical examination of the past, and not stifling the critical examination of the past. And I often tell my students, there is no one true history of any event. If there were, then we wouldn't need historians anymore. We wouldn't need to research and write history anymore. We would just take on face value historians from the 1930s and use their books and texts as gospel. But modern day ultra-conservatives say that anyone that goes and digs in the past to reinterpret the past are revisionist historians. Well, all history is revisionist. We're always finding new voices, new text, new ways to interpret the past. And no one is that unbiased that when they write history, they write one true account, because there are many voices. If you look at the Revolutionary War, if you want to give a full account, you look at the Founding Fathers, you look at the slaves they owned, you look at bankers. There's so many different voices and people that make up that universe that you would include in that history. But what President Trump is putting forth is this very clean national narrative, a very ultra-patriotic narrative of Columbus, that Columbus was the icon of Western civilization, and what he ushered in 1492 is to be completely celebrated and not critiqued. That if you critique Christopher Columbus Day, then you are not patriotic. That you are working against the national narrative. And the words that they use in the proclamation are amazing, because he actually, let me find it real quick. This is what Trump says. I have also taken steps to ensure that we preserve our nation's history and promote patriotic education. In July, I signed another executive order to build and rebuild monuments to iconic American figures in the National Garden of American Heroes. In September, I announced the creation of the 1776 Commission, which will encourage our educators to teach our children about the miracle of American history in honor of our founding. The miracle. That word is so loaded, in a word that should not be used in academics in sort of a historical sense. Miracle is a word that the founding fathers never used to describe American history. They saw it as an endeavor of humans with rational intellectual thought, reason, who were challenging medieval types of thinking that were founded in miracles. Jefferson hated the word miracle. He actually created his own Bible, where he took the New Testament and he cut out every mention of the word miracle, and made his own Bible, because he was a man of rational thought, reason, a man of the Enlightenment. The founding fathers would never, ever have referred to American history as a miracle. They're fighting against that kind of thought. And so here he is pandering to the religious right, his base, that sees miracles as part of their worldview. American history is not miraculous. It's created by people, for the people, in opposition to medieval thought that saw kings and queens as miraculous. But we can go on forever about this document. Go to whitehouse.com or .gov and read it for yourself. Proclamation on Columbus Day 2020. And I directly oppose this proclamation as a professional historian who believes in reason and critical examination of the past.
I totally agree with you, and I'm not a professional historian myself, but to use the word miracle is very controversial. I would say very astonishing. However, this does conclude our interview for today, and I just want to say thank you, Dr. Fontes, for this, and for everyone. Please watch out for more videos. I think our next one will be on Dia de los Muertos, and so just keep an eye out for those. This is our History Hub with Dr. Fontes, and we will keep you updated on important history facts. So thank you, Dr. Fontes.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor and pleasure again.